He has outstanding martial arts, but he has no place in the real world and can only be a notorious assassin. In the chaotic foreign world, on the battlefield of life and death, his strength was maximized. Here, he can wield his weapons without restraint. In order to survive, he had no choice but to embark on the path of his own king. His name is Tang Yin, and everything about him only exists in legends, keywords of the novel. Tang Yin has no pop-ups in the other world. Tang Yin downloads the complete collection of the TXT in the other world, and Tang Yin reads the latest chapters in the other world. Related to Tang Yin and Xia Wendong 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At this moment, Tang Yin, standing behind Chen Baicheng, shook his wrist and flashed a curved knife. Suddenly, his body shook and he flashed like an electric light next to Xia Wendong. His curved knife stabbed downwards with a click, and the blade penetrated deeply into the table in front of Xia Wendong. His movements were too fast, so fast that neither the Five Elements brothers or Gesang had a chance to stop him from moving forward. He coldly stabbed, but Xia Wendong didn't even blink his eyes. He slowly raised his eyes and looked at Tang Yin. Tang Yin smiled brightly, revealing 2 rows of white teeth. Who are you? Xia Wendong looked at Tang Yin's smiling face and smiled, squinting his eyes and asking. Tang Yin's mouth twitched, he bent down, leaned in close to Xia Wendong's ear, and whispered, "My name is Tang Yin, Tang of the great Tang, Yin of the ugly Yin." After finishing, his smile narrowed and he gently said, "Xia Wendong, I like you." As he finished speaking, he withdrew his curved sword, turned his body, and floated back behind Chen Baicheng like a ghost. From jumping out to jumping back, Tang Yin's movements were as fast as lightning. Oh, so this smiling young man is Tang Yin, so impressive. Xia Wendong didn't show any strangeness on his face, but he was surprised that he had killed Lu Gui's family. Tang Yin's sudden move surprised Chen Baicheng first, and then his heart was filled with joy. On the surface, Tang Yin followed his orders and acted only according to his own preferences. He was really afraid that Tang Yin would kill Xia Wendong in front of so many officials at this time. However, when he saw that Tang Yin was only trying to scare Xia Wendong, he also shocked the several bodyguards and Hiharan brought by Xia Wendong. He was secretly very happy and turned around, nodding to him with great appreciation. However, Tang Yin did not look at him, his eyes kept spinning around Xia Wendong. Related to Tang Yin and Xia Wendong 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The trees in winter have hard trunks, but Tang Yin's blade has deeply penetrated, demonstrating their immense strength. 23. His action immediately triggered a chain reaction, and all the guns that the Five Elements brothers had already put down were lifted again, pointing towards Tang Yin. Xia Wendong slowly raised his hand and pulled down the hand with the golden eye holding the gun. In Tang Yin's eyes, what he saw was not killing intent, but more anger and grievance, which reminded him of his past self and also aroused curiosity about Tang Yin's background. He grabbed his coat, swayed his body and sat on the road teeth, then patted the ground beside him, looked up and smiled at Tang Yin, saying, "Sit." Not to mention Tang Yin was stunned by Xia Wendong's actions. Even the Five Elements brothers were a bit dumbfounded and didn't understand what Dongga was up to. Tang Yin stared at Xia Wendong and asked in a daze, You're not afraid of me?" Xia Wendong smiled and said, "You have 2 knives, but I have 5 guns. Why should I be afraid of you?" No one has ever spoken to Tang Yin like this. Apart from fear and disgust, people also use Kalulu to exploit Tang Yin. He looked at Xia Wendong and smiled. Although he walked over very quickly, he still didn't do that in the end. He walked to the tree, slowly squatted down, and like a child, wielded a knife and randomly scratched on the ground. Xia Wendong and Tang Yin didn't speak, and just like that, they sat and crouched in close proximity, maintaining silence. I don't know how long it took, but Tang Yin suddenly spoke up and said, "When you were still children and indulged in your parents' arms, I faced cold walls. When you grew up carefree under your parents' protection, I had to kneel down and beg for a bite of food every day. When you were playing happily, I was bullied and insulted by children of the same age. There is no dignity, no hope, no color, there are white eyes, indifference, and spitting on my face. My childhood was like this, black and white. I hate this world, I hate everyone in this world. All it brings me is pain and despair. Now, I want to give back all of this. I want everyone to experience the feeling I had before, the deep despair that I couldn't extricate myself and couldn't break free from. After listening to Tang Yin's words, Xia Wendong also guessed about his background. Due to being an orphan, Tang Yin was once ridiculed and despised, which gave rise to the idea of hating this world. He took off his gloves and extended his hand in front of Tang Yin, asking, "Did you see it?" "What do you see?" Tang Yin raised his gaze and asked strangely. "Scars." "Oh." Tang Yinzi examined carefully and found a long horizontal scar on Xia Wendong's palm. A hint of confusion flashed in his eyes, not understanding why Xia Wendong wanted him to see this. Xia Wendong smiled and said, "Back then, when I was in school, I encountered things similar to you and was often bullied. At that time, I also hated this world, and even my parents. Why did they make me so weak?" Tang Yin's eyes sparkled with brilliance, staring at him without blinking. "This scar was the gift I gave myself at that time," Xia Wendong said quietly. "What we share is that we have chosen violence to become stronger and no longer be bullied. The difference is that you choose to kill alone, experiencing pleasure from blood and pain, while I choose to use conquest to understand my existence in this world and experience the joy and achievement. Although we have chosen different paths, you and I are actually the same kind of person." People who are unwilling to be swayed by fate and do not believe in fate. On Tang Yin's body, Xia Wendong did indeed see his own shadow, but of course, he did not agree with the path Tang Yin had chosen. Tang Yin lowered his head and remained silent for a long time, but the string deep within him had been touched by Xia Wendong's words. After a while, he whispered, "If you had met a few years earlier, you might have become friends, but now, it's too late, we're enemies." Xia Wendong said, "Fate can be changed, paths can be chosen, if you want to do it." Tang Yin suddenly stood up with a cold expression and said, "I have never had friends, and I don't need friends either." As he spoke, he shook his wrist and put away his knife, saying, "Xia Wendong, don't think your words today will move me. When we meet again, my knife will still cut your neck without hesitation." Xia Wendong nodded and then chuckled lightly, saying, "I believe the world can change people, but people can also change the world." Then, he extended his palm and smiled, "I can make the world dance in my palm and rotate according to my rules, and you are just one of them." Tang Yin was stunned by Xia Wendong. After a while, he shook his head and said, "You're even crazier than me." After finishing, he turned around and left. Chapter 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chengdu, late at night. 23, Tang Yin sat in front of a dance hall called Night Fire, drinking. This is his 5th day in Chengdu. He likes alcohol, also enjoys the environment in this dance hall, and prefers to listen to the intense music inside. "Are you alone?" A girl in her 20s sat next to Tang Yin and looked at him with a smile on her face. Tang Yin has a handsome appearance, with fair skin, thick eyebrows and big eyes. The corners of his mouth are naturally raised, and even when he has a straight face, it seems like he is smiling. A handsome smile can easily make people feel good about him. Of course, for strangers and those who are familiar with him, his smile can make people feel creepy. Because he is a killer who kills without blinking an eye. Tang Yin turned his head and looked at the girl inexplicably, asking in confusion, "Do we know each other?" The girl's appearance may not be considered beautiful, but it is definitely not unattractive. She is wearing a cool navel-revealing outfit on her upper body and hot pants below, revealing 2 plump and slender legs. The sexy clothing makes her beautiful figure look even more attractive. The girl smiled slightly, shook her head, and said, I am the waiter here. I have been watching you come over to drink alone for several consecutive days. Oh. Tang Yin shook his glass and didn't say much with a smile. His mind is very intelligent, at least much smarter than the average person, and he can never forget the people who can attract his attention, even after a glance and several years later. However, there are not many people in this world who have attracted his attention. Tang Yin's smiling face is approachable, but when you really come into contact with him, you will clearly feel the coldness behind his smiling face, that kind of coldness that comes from the bone. Are you not from Chengdu? What are you doing in Chengdu? Are you on a business trip? The girl seemed to be very interested in Tang Yin and turned a blind eye to his indifference. Zilai asked proficiently. Tang Yin looked at the wine glass in his hand, still silent. People he doesn't want to pay attention to will never say one more word to him. Just as the girl was feeling embarrassed, a big hand suddenly reached out from behind Tang Yin and pressed it onto his shoulder. At the same time, a rude voice sounded behind him, Brother, someone has taken up the seat you're sitting in. Give way. Upon hearing this, Tang Yin and the girl beside him turned their heads together. There were 4 young people standing behind Tang Yin, dressed in flowing clothes. The others did not catch Tang Yin's attention, but the 4 shiny bald heads were particularly eye-catching, as if 4 large light bulbs were lined up behind him. Seeing these 4 people clearly, the girl's face immediately showed a look of disgust, but there was a hint of awe and fear in her eyes. Tang Yin looked bewildered and said, I've always been sitting here. Always. Yes. Tang Yin said solemnly, it's been 5 days already. He. The bald man, who reached out and pressed his shoulder, sneered and pointed his nose with his thumb, saying, Damn it, our brothers have been living here for 5 years. Kid, you sensible bastard, hurry up and don't cause trouble, otherwise you will suffer. As he spoke, he lifted the collar of his clothes slightly, revealing a hidden knife hidden under them. Tang Yin stared straight at the knife. After a while, he seemed timid and swallowed his saliva. He stood up and smiled, saying, This seat is indeed yours. He picked up his glass and walked towards the empty table in the distance. Ha! As they watched Tang Yin's runaway figure, the 4 bald men burst out laughing wildly. Subsequently, his body swayed and he sat around the girl. The girl was greatly disappointed by Tang Yin's cowardice. Looking at these 4 bald men, her face became even more disgusted. She stood up and wanted to leave, grabbing her wrist for the bald man and playfully asking, Jiao, where are you going? Why are you leaving when we come? The girl shook the bald man's hand hard and said angrily, I'm going to work. The bald man said with a smile on his face, when that little white face was sitting here just now, you didn't mean to go to work. You even talked and laughed with him. Why are you going to work when our brothers come? Jiao, you don't give our brothers face. That's right, the other 3 bald men followed and coaxed. The girl knows these 4 people and knows that they are this notorious thug who seems to have connections with the local big gang organization. She hates them and dares not offend them. She took a deep breath and coquettishly said, What the hell are you doing? The bald man smiled and said, It's nothing else, I just want to treat you to a drink. As he spoke, he leaned aside and nodded to his companion. A bald man understood and took out a bottle of red wine from his pocket, poured a full glass, and pushed it in front of the girl. The girl changed color slightly and shook her head, saying, I don't know how to drink. Before he could finish speaking, the bald man interrupted, I'll treat you to a drink, even if it's just a sip. Otherwise, you won't give me this face. The girl knows that these bastards are shameless, and if they don't drink this glass of wine today, they will definitely not give up easily. For their sake, the girl helplessly turned her heart and said, Then. I'll just take a sip. Okay. Haha. The bald man laughed proudly and nodded repeatedly. Picking up the glass, the girl gathered her courage and took a big sip of the wine with her head up. After drinking alcohol, a spicy taste surged from her stomach all the way to her hair. She felt like she was about to exhale fire, and her fair face turned red, making the girl's appearance even more charming and charming. The bald man's eyes were almost straight as he looked, and it took him a while to come back to his senses. He clapped his hands and laughed heartily, repeatedly saying, "Good tolerance for alcohol, good tolerance for alcohol, take another sip, come, take another sip." The girl still wanted to shirk, but the bald man picked up his glass and forced it into her mouth. In an instant, the remaining half of the glass of wine was forcefully poured into the girl's stomach, and her face became increasingly flushed. She wiped away the wine stains from the corners of her mouth and gasped for breath, saying, "Can I leave now?" The bald man and several companions exchanged a glance and coincidentally showed a bad smile. He nodded and said, "Okay. You go ahead and get busy." Upon hearing these words, the girl felt relieved and quickly stood up, but as soon as she stood up, she suddenly felt like the world was about to fly. She couldn't stand up, swayed her body, and finally sat back in the chair, her head feeling dizzy and painful and swollen. At this point, she finally realized that something was wrong. No matter how poor her alcohol tolerance was, it wouldn't be so bad. The other person must have taken psychedelic drugs or something in the wine. But it was too late for her to figure it out now, and her consciousness gradually disappeared from her mind. She sat in a chair, swaying her body, with a dull expression on her face, and occasionally looked at everyone around her with silly smiles. Seeing that they had succeeded, the four bald men smiled even harder and exchanged glances. They helped the girl up with their hands and feet, and occasionally said, "You've drunk too much. If you can't drink, don't drink. Let's take you to rest." Four bald men carried unconscious girls through the dance hall and walked straight towards the back door. Everything that happened here was clearly observed by Tang Yin not far away. He had an impulse to rush forward and stop them, but soon he suppressed it. He was not a good person and there was no need to save anyone. Causing trouble was equivalent to creating trouble for himself. Although rationality prevailed, the figure of the girl occasionally appeared in his mind, making him feel a bit restless and restless. Damn it! Tang Yin cursed inwardly, hating the feeling of uncontrollable impulses. He looked up and drank the glass of wine clean, then raised his hand and made a crisp snap of his fingers. A waitress nearby walked over and asked with a smile, "Sir, do you need anything?" "Wine," Tang Yin said bluntly. "What kind of wine?" The waitress was amused by him. 10 out of 10 people who came to the dance hall were ordering alcohol. Strong liquor. Volga. Sure. A cup. A bottle. The waitress was stunned for a moment, looked at Tang Yin suspiciously, paused for a moment, and then smiled and said, "Okay, sir, please wait a moment." Chapter 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Not long after, the girl walked back with a tray, placed a bottle of vodka in front of Tang Yin, and then gave him a deep glance before slowly walking away. Reading novels to the climax, opening the lid, Tang Yin poured a full glass, and with just one look up, the glass of wine was consumed by him. The high concentration of alcohol in his stomach was like countless knives slashing through his body, and he closed his eyes, his fingers pounding rapidly on the table. After a while, he slowly opened his eyes. In that moment, it seemed as if 2 rays of light were shining out of his eyes, but it was brief and fleeting. Tang Yin Chang took a deep breath, pushed the bottle and glass forward, then took out his wallet, pulled out several 100-yuan bills, and placed them neatly on the table. He stood up and walked towards the back door of the dance hall. He knew he shouldn't walk this way, but his legs were out of control. The dance hall is glamorous and decorated brilliantly, while the alleyway behind the dance hall is a different scene. Dark, damp, dirty, and chaotic. Just a wall of pavilion, it is a paradise and a hell. After leaving the back door, a foul smell of garbage and decay rushed towards Tang Yin, who couldn't help but frown. At this moment, a groan came from deep in the alley. The voice was very low and faint, which ordinary people wouldn't hear, but it couldn't escape Tang Yin's ears. He turned around and walked straight towards the depths of the alley. The narrow alleyway was dim and dark, terrifying. In the middle of the night, there was an indescribable terror, and as we walked deeper, it felt like approaching the mouth of a huge monster. Walking more than 10 meters away, a group of people squatted in the corner of the alley. The 4 bald men placed the unconscious girl on the ground, her clothes already stripped bare. The 4 of them gathered around, facing her up and down, occasionally emitting laughter and whispers. In a cold moment, they heard footsteps behind them, and the 4 of them were startled. They quickly looked up and looked back. At first, the distance was quite far, and they didn't see Tang Yin's appearance clearly. After he approached, the 4 bald men finally saw it clearly, and at the same time, they took a breath, realizing it was the cowardly white face in the dance hall. The good news had just begun when someone disturbed him. He stood up straight for the bald man, with a fierce expression on his face and fierce eyes, staring fiercely at Tang Yin, like a wolf that had been robbed of food. He could pounce and bite Tang Yin fiercely at any moment. At this moment, Tang Yin's heart was also very conflicted. With his head down, as he walked past the 4 bald men and the girls, his footsteps did not stop, but slowly walked over. Shit! Some people sneered in their bald heads. Tang Yin's indifference turned into cowardice in their eyes, and became the catalyst for their unbridled behavior. Someone said coldly, "You are smart and dare to cause trouble. I will kill you with a bloody knife." Haha. Third, don't scare him. Look at how his fetal hair hasn't molted, maybe he's still a student. What a student. Damn it, I think he's just a bastard. A few bald men shouted and mocked each other, their voices getting louder and their words becoming increasingly unpleasant. Upon hearing the word bastard, Tang Yin, who had already walked over, suddenly stopped. Bastard. He hasn't heard these 2 words for several years. He is an orphan who has been living in a remote mountain village in northeast China since he was adopted. During his time, many people used these 2 words to curse at him, but now those people no longer exist. He stood in the alley, with his back to the bald man, half turned back and asked with a smile, "What did you say just now?" "Say what?" A bald man laughed angrily and shouted, "Say you are an asshole, his mother bastard." Tang Yin breathed a sigh of relief in his heart, as if he was not angry. He slowly turned around and walked straight towards the 4 bald men. The 4 of them were momentarily stunned, then met Tang Yin head-on and stood in front of him in a fan-shaped position, sneering at the bald man, "Kid, what are you doing? Are you looking for trouble?" Before he could finish speaking, suddenly a terrifyingly bright electric light flashed through the dark alley, and his earrings clicked. Looking at the bald man again, his round and plump head fell off his neck and fell to the ground, rolling out for a long time. Then, with a swoop, a pot of hot blood sprayed out from his broken neck, like a red fountain. In the darkness, it was enchanting and ghostly. Ah! The other 3 bald men couldn't believe their own eyes, raised their hands in a daze, touched the blood droplets splattered on their faces, and then stood still in place with their headless bodies. They all let out a chilling scream. At some point, Tang Yin had an extra crescent-shaped curved sword in his hand. The blade is narrow and curved in a half-moon shape. When viewed coldly, it looks like a sickle. It's just a death sickle that can hook away people's souls. How he drew his sword, from which part of his body he drew it, and how he used his moves, the 3 bald men and the deceased did not see clearly. What they saw was the sudden appearance of an electric light. Pop it. A bald man with weak legs knelt on the ground, his face pale and devoid of blood, his body trembling like a ball. He trembled and looked up at Tang Yin, saying in a trembling voice, "Big brother, we." Tang Yin didn't give him a chance to speak at all. The crescent-curved sword in his hand just shook slightly, and the sharp tip of the knife had deeply penetrated the bald neck. Still a fatal blow, the bald sound fell to the ground without a sound. Mom. At best, gangsters are just participating in a fight. When have you seen such a scene, and how have you ever encountered such a powerful and vicious character? The other two bald men were scared out of their wits, both screamed and turned around to run. They shook off their legs and tried their best to escape, but in Tang Yin's eyes, it was almost as fast as a turtle crawling. He shook his body and leaped behind the two with just one arrow step, his hand wielding a knife and falling. With two muffled thuds, both of them were pierced in their hearts, and their rushing bodies took a few more steps forward before collapsing and dying in despair. Hurry up. Tang Yin's sword is not just a fast word. The person who adopted him, also known as his master, once said that martial arts is all about fighting, and one must not show mercy when making a move, but rather to kill your opponent. To achieve this, one must have speed. There is no martial arts skill in the world that can defeat an opponent even in a slow and leisurely manner, including Tai Chi. And strength determines speed. So, when Tang Yin was only 8 years old, even in icy and snowy conditions, he had to use a large axe that was about the same height as him to cut down even thicker trees in the deep mountains and forests. If he can't meet his master's request, after returning, he will go and grab food with his master's hunting dog. When he was 15 years old, he finally didn't have to use a big axe to chop trees anymore. His master gave him a big machete. When he was 18 years old, the machete was replaced with a kitchen knife. When he was 20 years old, he killed his master in a fair and upright duel, using his true talent and practical skills to kill him. In his childhood, he never understood what happiness was. During that period, he had already finished all the hardships that a normal person could not endure for several lifetimes, so in the future, no matter how difficult the situation may be, he could persevere and grit his teeth to get through it. This is Tang Yin. A man who will be respected, admired, feared, and hated by countless people in the future. When the girl woke up, she was already lying in the hospital. She asked the nurse why she was here, and the nurse told her that it was a man who brought him over. She asked, "What kind of man is he?" The nurse was in a daze for a moment, then smiled and said, "He's a very handsome and funny boy." Chapter 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Early morning. 23, Forest. A drop of dew falling from a leaf fell on his face, and Tang Yin, lying flat under the tree, slightly twitched his eyelids before slowly waking up. I don't know why, he has a severe headache, as if there are countless steel needles growing in his head, piercing everywhere. He let out a painful moan and raised his hand to vigorously rub his forehead. After a while, he felt a little stronger. He slowly opened his eyes, looked around at the scenery, and as he looked, his eyes widened. In the end, he unconsciously stood up and looked around at the dense forest with a bewildered face. If I remember correctly, why did I suddenly run into the forest when I was living in a hotel? Unable to figure out what the situation was, Tang Yin's brow twisted into a knot. If someone secretly moved me here while I was sleeping, it's almost impossible. Firstly, no one would do this, and secondly, no one could do it. Even when I'm sleeping, I'm still very alert and no one can approach me silently. While pondering, a gust of mountain wind blew through the forest, causing Tang Yin's spirit to shiver and a layer of goosebumps covered his body. He lowered his head and his old face turned red. It turned out that his body was naked, not a single inch hanging, and his clothes had disappeared without a trace. What exactly is going on? What a coincidence. Tang Yin's body softened and he leaned against an old tree beside him, closed his eyes, and quietly recalled what had happened last night. He was drinking in the dance hall when a girl came to strike up a conversation, but 4 other thugs came to find fault. He didn't pay attention at the time, but later killed all 4 thugs in the alley behind the dance hall. Later, he took the girl who had been drugged to the hospital and went back to the hotel to rest. But when he woke up, He was here and had no clothes left, which was really strange. Thinking about it, Tang Yin couldn't help but shake his head and smile bitterly. Did the enemy find him? If that's the case, the other party would have killed themselves long ago, and it wouldn't have cost so much effort. Is it a prank by friends? He has no friends, strictly speaking, there is one, and that person would never play tricks on him in this way. What exactly is going on? Tang Yin wanted to break his mind but couldn't understand. What a sight! Tang Yin muttered to himself. He turned back to the old tree behind him, took a few steps back, and suddenly leaped forward, using both hands and feet. His agile body was like a civet cat, and he climbed up to the treetop with just a few steps. He struggled to climb to a high point, set up a pergola with his hands, and looked up into the distance. What caught the eye was a vast expanse of green, an endless forest that seemed to have no end, forming a line with the sky. It's better not to look at it. After reading it, Tang Yin grinned inwardly. Now he can be certain that this is definitely not Chengdu, because Chengdu definitely does not have such a large primitive forest. Where is this? Tang Yin bit his lip and slowly slid down the tree trunk. If it were someone else, I would probably feel hopeless at this moment, with nothing left and inexplicably arriving at a huge forest. It was almost impossible to survive, and Tang Yin was only surprised, but he was not afraid in his heart. He wandered through the deep mountains and old forests in the northeast, which were an extremely familiar place to him. Compared to them, the forests in the northeast were even more difficult, and those who had not tried to spit out foam and fell to the ground would not understand it. He can survive in the northeast forest at -40 to 50 degrees Celsius, let alone here. However, the double swords he often used were useless, which made Tang Yin very heartbroken. For a warrior like him, martial arts is life. Losing the twin swords is equivalent to losing half of one's life. He looked around and picked up a broken tree fork from the ground. He skillfully broke off the branches on top and made it into a wooden stick. In the unfamiliar forest, danger was everywhere, and with a stick, at least it could be considered a life-saving weapon. Then he used to break off the branches and weave them into a circular shape, clasping them under his own span to cover them. After everything was done, Tang Yin waved his stick casually and gritted his teeth, saying, "If I know who did it, I can't spare him." He judged the general direction based on the position of the sun, thought for a moment, and walked towards the north with great strides. He didn't know which direction to walk quickly out of this forest, it was entirely based on his feelings. This forest seems to have no end. Tang Yin walked from early morning until noon, still within the forest. At the same time, he became increasingly confused. It is difficult to understand where such a large forest came from. Who would spend so much effort to get himself here? He has too many questions in his heart. Just as he was about to climb up the tree and discern the direction again, he suddenly heard bursts of roars coming from ahead. Due to the distance, the sound was blurry and low. Tang Yin's spirit was boosted, and he was stunned for a moment. He shook the wooden stick tightly, shook his legs, and ran quickly in the direction of the sound. The more you run forward, the clearer the sound becomes, and it's very chaotic. There are sounds of iron objects colliding and fighting, shouting, and the sound of tearing lungs and screams, too many voices mixed together, making it difficult to hear each one count, which made Tang Yin feel like he was approaching a large battlefield. But it's ridiculous to think about it. Who would go to war in the forest? And they still use cold weapons. If it's a mafia, that's funny. What are they fighting in this desolate and crowded place? Gradually, the trees in the forest became increasingly sparse, and large patches of grassland appeared. It felt like they were approaching the chaotic area. Tang Yin gradually slowed down and instinctively bent down, cautiously approaching forward. His attention was focused on the front, but suddenly his feet softened and he was hit by something soft and fluffy. Tang Yin couldn't stand and grabbed onto the ground, but fortunately it was a grassy area. He didn't feel any pain when he fell on it. He cursed softly, got up from the ground, and turned his head to look. His face suddenly showed shock. It turned out that he had been hit by a person covered in blood, lying motionless on the ground. Tang Yin took a cold breath and frowned as he stared at the person. The person was wearing a black long shirt, leather armor coated with black paint on his chest, walking boots under his feet, holding a long spear tightly in his hand, facing his head, and wearing a steel helmet made of black iron. Judging from his attire alone, he was almost no different from ancient soldiers. Is this making a movie? Tang Yin burst out laughing and looked around. The sound of fighting was heard in his ears, but the camera did not see it. It's obvious that the camera is not here at all. Is this actor who plays the role of the dead really too dedicated? Thinking about it, he picked up a stick and poked the person, saying, "Get up, brother, your play is over." The person lay on the ground unresponsive, motionless, and even seemed to have no breath. Their pale and ashen face was no different from that of a dead person. Tang Yin raised his eyebrows and slowly withdrew the stick. He saw that the head of the stick was covered in blood, so he used his fingers to touch it. It was sticky, and when he lowered his head, he smelled a sweet and fishy smell. Tang Yin was experienced and immediately realized that this was real blood, not fake. He widened his eyes, approached the person, and reached out to touch their neck. His body temperature was cold, and there was no pulse in his veins. Ah! Tang Yin was secretly surprised. This was a real dead person, not a fake one. In this case, it was not acting or filming, but a real fight. It's just strange, no one else is wearing such clothes now. Tang Yin stood up and wanted to pass through the forest. He went outside to see what was going on. After taking 2 steps, he paused and looked down at his naked body, which was only covered by a circle of branches. This was even more shocking than the attire of the dead person. He sighed and turned to look at the corpse, then walked back and murmured, "Friend, I'm sorry, your clothes are more useful to me than to you." As he spoke, he quickly took off the corpse's clothes and put them on himself. Just at this moment, Tang Yin didn't know that his life began to undergo a complete transformation when he put on this outfit. Tang Yin is of medium build, and the size of his clothes is not very special, so he can basically wear them. Wearing the clothes of the dead, although the sticky blood made Tang Yin feel uncomfortable, it was much better than just running away. Finally, he picked up the leather armor and weighed it in his hand. Feeling that it weighed quite a bit, he casually threw it away and pulled out the spear from the corpse's hand. Holding it in his hand, it was really a dangerous situation. The spear was much more effective than the stick he had just made. With his clothes and weapons, Tang Yin glanced at the corpse on the ground and let out a sinister laugh. Then he took a deep breath and crawled out of the forest with his furry waist. When he stepped out of the forest, cleared away the dense weeds, and looked out, he was immediately stunned by the scene before him. Chapter 4. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Outside the forest lies an endless grassland, with blue sky, white clouds, and green grass, which were originally the beauty of the countryside. However, at this moment, there is no beauty to speak of, and there is a tearing of blood and tears. 23. On the grassland, thousands of people are fighting against each other. One side is wearing black helmets, black clothes, and black armor, which is exactly the same as what Tang Yin is wearing now, while the other side is silver and white armor, which is shining and dazzling in the sunlight. The battle between the two sides can no longer be described as intense, but rather a real and fierce battle, fought for either death or life. On the battlefield, people waved their weapons and tried everything possible to kill each other. Groups of people were injured and fell to the ground, and soon more people rushed over. All kinds of weapons fell together, stabbing and chopping the fallen into flesh and mud. Tang Yin has killed many people and participated in many large-scale underworld battles, but he has never seen such a real and brutal battle scene, nor has he ever seen people so crazy, almost like beasts. At this moment, he was stunned by the scene before him. Ah! Tang Yin's body was in the grass, his head sticking out to look around. Just as he was in a daze, a war horse rushed over from his right side. There was a knight with a silver helmet and armor sitting on his horse, staring at Tang Yin's head with bloodshot eyes. The spear in his hand was extended forward, and the tip of the spear pierced Tang Yin's neck. The speed of the warhorse was too fast as an arrow that left the string. Tang Yin was in extreme shock and did not realize that danger had descended on his head. At this critical moment, a young man wearing black armor pounced on Tang Yin fiercely. With a muffled thud, Tang Yin and the middle-aged man fell into the grass together. At the same time, with a whoosh, the warhorse swept past the two of them, and the knight's spear brushed against their scalp. %. Yuan. The middle-aged man sat up from the ground, panting heavily while grabbing Tang Yin's neck and shouting loudly. His words emphasize strangeness, whether Tang Yin understands or not. He has traveled to many places in China and can distinguish dialects from other places. However, the words of this middle-aged man do not seem to be dialects from any other place. Although he didn't know what the other person was saying to him, he knew that the middle-aged man had just saved his life. Tang Yin looked straight at the middle-aged man and spoke forcefully, wanting to ask what exactly this place was and who these people were. However, on second thought, he swallowed back the words that had reached his mouth. He cannot understand the other person's words, and the other person may not be able to understand his own words. The reason why this person saved himself must be because of his attire. Obviously, he regarded himself as his own person. If he spoke up and said something he did not understand, he might consider himself a spy. At this moment, the situation is both eerie and dangerous. If both the black and white sides consider themselves as enemies, it would be terrible. The harsh and cruel childhood nurtured Tang Yin's suspicious and cautious personality. He didn't ask a question, just opened his mouth wide and made a sound of, ah ah. The middle-aged man was taken aback and asked a question. Tang Yin didn't know what he was asking, just nodded. The middle-aged man shook his head and sighed, with a hint of regret in his eyes. Tang Yin felt that the other party was treating him like a mute. When the middle-aged man was still about to speak, the knight who had already rushed over turned his horse's head and turned it back. Due to anger, his facial features twisted into a ball, and he screamed incessantly, seeming extremely angry that the spear he had just used did not kill Tang Yin. At this moment, Tang Yin had regained his senses and watched as the other party rode towards him again. A fierce light flashed in his eyes, and he waved his hand to push the middle-aged man away. At the same time, he jumped out of the grass and stood on the flat ground, holding a spear alone, watching as the knight urged his horse to rush towards him. The middle-aged man who just saved Tang Yin was shocked and yelled at him repeatedly, meaning to make him dodge immediately. In his opinion, if an infantry wants to take on a cavalry alone, it is simply seeking death. Tang Yin did not move. He never understood what concession was. The knight was getting closer and closer to him, and Tang Yin even knew the cold and cruel smile on the other person's face. He was also laughing, and his smile was even more gloomy and cold. In an instant, the knight rode his horse close to Tang Yin and thrust his spear forward, piercing directly into Tang Yin's chest. Tang Yin's originally upright body suddenly moved without any warning, but his body moved half a meter horizontally like lightning, avoiding the opponent's sharpness and the impact of the warhorse. At the same time, he lifted his spear upwards and heard a thud, the tip of the spear piercing the knight's throat. Tang Yin did not exert any force, but the inertia of the warhorse's forward charge was too great. The knight's neck was instantly pierced by the tip of the spear, and he did not even make a sound. He fell off the warhorse with a thud, his eyes wide open, motionless, and he gasped on the spot. The horse, which had lost its owner, let out a long hiss and ran into the wilderness. A spear pierced and killed a knight on horseback, and Tang Yin could be said to have played the three key points of fast, accurate, and ruthless to the extreme. The black and white personnel around him who were still fighting were also shocked and looked at Tang Yin in shock. The middle-aged man suddenly came to his senses and climbed out of the grass, dancing and shouting repeatedly. Upon hearing his shout, the black-clad personnel around him also shouted out loud. Tang Yin didn't know what they were shouting, but he could feel that the waves of shouting were very inspiring and made people's blood boil. It wasn't until soon that he understood that they were shouting "wind," which was also the name of their country. Tang Yin shocked everyone, inspiring the fighting spirit of the black-clad personnel around him. Similarly, it also aroused the hatred and anger of those in white helmets and armor. Roar! Almost at the same time, dozens of white-armored soldiers rushed towards Tang Yin, some wielding long swords, some wielding swords, and some wielding spears. This group of fierce and vicious men rushed towards him. If anyone else had already been frightened, Tang Yin didn't care at all. He sneered and reached out to pull out the spear from the neck of the corpse, not retreating but moving forward, charging back towards the opponent. In the blink of an eye, the two sides met. As soon as they engaged, Tang Yin let out a shout, and his spear was like a spirit snake, piercing straight into the chest of a man in white iron armor. Although he was not bulky, his strength was astonishing. With one spear, he pierced through the man's iron armor, and the bloody tip of the spear protruded from behind. Tang Yin held a spear with one hand and swung it vigorously, throwing the corpse with a long spear out. At this moment, another white-helmeted man fell close to him, swung his sword, and swung it. Tang Yin dodged on his side, then turned back with an elbow. This elbow hit the opponent's face with a heavy blow, and the latter let out a scream, sprayed blood all over his face, and stumbled back. Without waiting for Tang Yin to withdraw his spear, the other enemies had already rushed forward, attacking and stabbing him. Tang Yin could sense that although these people don't know kung fu, they must have undergone close combat training, and their moves are fierce and fast, all aimed at the key points. His weapon was the Twilight Moon double blade, which was extremely difficult to use with his spear. He withdrew and retreated, allowing several enemies to attack, and then withdrew his spear. He held the spear in both hands, clenched it tightly, lowered it down, and then let out a loud shout. He lifted his leg and hit the spear with his knees. Crack! The wooden shaft of the spear broke in response to the sound, and Tang Yin twisted his arms vigorously, dividing the spear in half. His sudden action not only surprised the white-armored men, but even the black-clothed people did not understand his intentions, suspecting that he had a brain problem and destroyed his weapons on the battlefield. They didn't know that Tang Yin was skilled with short weapons, and although the broken spear was not as powerful as the double sword, it at least wielded greater power. Ah! Tang Yin let out a sudden roar and rushed forward again. This time, he exerted all his strength, his body like a loach, and he walked freely through the crowd of the other party. His half-pointed spear occasionally splashed blood, accompanied by piercing screams. Dozens of silver-armored soldiers, not only did not harm Tang Yin at all, but were also killed by him with thorns, and more than 10 people. Seeing him so brave and unstoppable, the white-helmeted soldiers were scared out of their wits and retreated one after another, while the black-helmeted soldiers cheered and rushed forward, shouting. Throughout the battlefield, the white side was in a situation of chasing and killing the enemy, with an absolute advantage, while the black side was the defeated and fleeing side, at an absolute disadvantage. However, in the corner where Tang Yin was located, the situation reversed, and the black side launched a counterattack under his leadership, intercepting and repelling the white side's pursuers. However, their role did not have a significant impact on the entire battlefield. When Tang Yin was on the rise of killing, he suddenly heard someone shouting behind him. He was bleeding like his life and couldn't stop his killing intent. Moreover, he couldn't understand what the people behind him were shouting, ignored them, and wanted to continue chasing the white-helmeted soldiers. At this moment, his wrist tightened and he was firmly grasped by someone. Tang Yin didn't even think about it. He wanted to stab him with a spear, but it was clear that the person pulling him was a middle-aged man with a black helmet who had just saved his life. The spear he had stabbed quickly retracted and looked at the other person in confusion. P.S. Sisters and brothers of the villains, let's grow up. Let's inform each other that other sisters and brothers who don't know about Tang Yin in the alien world will create a miracle again. Everyone, save it. Chapter 5. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Tang Yin is a person who has a clear sense of gratitude and resentment. Although he was born cold and cruel, it was caused by his tragic childhood experiences. In his life, few people really treated him well, and it was because of this that he would always remember any kindness given to him, especially since this middle-aged man had saved his life. The middle-aged man didn't know that he had almost become the ghost under Tang Yin's spear. He was full of anxiety and shouted loudly at Tang Yin, while pulling him back. "What are you running for? Isn't it that I can't beat them myself?" Tang Yin frowned and stood firm without moving a step. The middle-aged man saw his stubbornness and pointed towards the front, shouting repeatedly. Tang Yin looked in the direction of his fingers, and his eyebrows immediately furrowed. He saw dust flying behind Bai Fong, covering almost half of the sky. A sandstorm. This was the first word that came to Tang Yin's mind, but soon he realized he was wrong. It was not a sandstorm, but the dust splattered by the massive cavalry team charging at full speed. Gradually, the ground began to vibrate, with thunderous roars coming from afar. We had not yet seen the specific appearance of the other party, and the overwhelming momentum had already overwhelmed them, making it difficult for them to catch their breath. Tang Yin is not a fool. At this moment, he certainly won't insist on staying. There's no need for the middle-aged person to pull him anymore. He grabbed the middle-aged person's wrist with his back hand and ran away. As the cavalry of the white side was driven down, the situation on the battlefield became even more precarious. The black side soldiers gave up resistance and retreated in batches. This run is a struggle against the Grim Reaper. Many soldiers have thrown away their black helmets, armor, and weapons, and the momentum of defeat is like a flood-flowing river. Tang Yin pulled the middle-aged man and ran along with the black army, feeling increasingly frustrated as he ran. He didn't attract anyone and didn't provoke anyone. Why did he get into such trouble? First, I inexplicably slept in the forest, and then inexplicably got involved in this battle of the cold weapon age. What exactly is going on? Until now, he has not figured out why he is in such a situation. But getting involved is easy, and it's difficult to get out again. It can be said that from the moment he put on the black soldier uniform, his fate had already changed, and he had embarked on a thrilling and exciting path. The escape continued, and the enemies behind him were relentlessly chasing after him. At the end of the escape, Tang Yin didn't even remember how far he had run. He only remembered that the middle-aged man's physical strength was not sustained and he gradually couldn't keep up with the speed. He simply put the middle-aged man on his shoulder. Tang Yin had a slender figure and was able to run against a single person, but his speed was not slower than the people around him, and he was not as panting or sweating as the others. He walked swiftly, occasionally throwing the deserters ahead behind him. At this moment, he realized that this was not just a battle of a few hundred people, but there were thousands of deserters on the black side alone. As the saying goes, panic leads to no choice. This large number of fleeing black soldiers precisely cited this term. I don't know who led the way, but when they passed through a valley, they couldn't run forward anymore. It turned out that this valley was a dead valley, with a circular shape inside. There was no other way out except for the passage at the valley entrance. However, when they wanted to turn back, it was already too late. The valley entrance was tightly sealed by countless white soldiers, and even a mouse couldn't get through, let alone humans. More than 3,000 deserters from the black side were forcibly trapped in this dead valley, while the soldiers from the white side gathered more and more at the entrance of the valley. From a distance, there were white flowers, estimated to be at least 50,000 people. the person leading the way should be cut 1,000 times. Tang Yin silently cursed in his heart as he looked around the valley. The valley is deep, surrounded by cliffs and cliffs, as if cut by a huge axe. The pitch-black cliffs are smooth like mirrors, with no grass growing. Even top mountaineers find it difficult to climb, let alone have no climbing tools in their hands now. Tang Yin was a man with a pale face, but now he couldn't help sweating. Looking at the black soldiers around us, their faces were filled with despair. No wonder they were desperate. The number of soldiers on both sides is not proportional, and most of them have neither armor nor weapons. The number of soldiers with injuries is even more numerous. In addition, they are now in a desperate situation, and almost no one still holds hope for survival. Gulu! Gulu gulu! Suddenly, shouting came from the mouth of the valley, with a loud and clear voice that could be heard from a long distance. The shouting caused a commotion among the lifeless black soldiers, and many of them slowly straightened their bodies and walked towards the direction of the valley. At this moment, a big man wearing a black battle robe and looking like a general let out a loud roar, shouting at the soldiers who wanted to walk towards the valley. The rest of the soldiers sitting still on the ground also showed a look of disdain. The soldiers walking towards the valley lowered their heads one after another, their faces and ears red, and slowly sat back on the ground. Tang Yin didn't know what they were talking about, but he also guessed a rough idea. Obviously, the white side had just shouted to persuade surrender, while someone on the black side was tempted, but the general in charge stopped them. This general is quite imposing, not someone who is greedy for life and afraid of death. Thinking about it, Tang Yin couldn't help but take a few more glances. The general, dressed in his 30s, had a rough and fierce appearance, with blood on his face and body, making him look even more ferocious and terrifying. Tang Yin withdrew his gaze and turned to look at the young people around him. The middle-aged man noticed his gaze and shook his head with a bitter smile at Tang Yin, whispering something. Although Tang Yin couldn't understand, he could feel his sadness and despair from his tone. How will the other party deal with them next? Tang Yin frowned and silently pondered. Seeing no movement from the enemy in the valley, there were shouts coming from the other side, but this time the tone became stern and cold, with a final warning. Roar! The general suddenly turned around and let out a loud roar. Upon being summoned by him, all the soldiers stood up and also picked up their weapons. Are we going to make the final battle? Tang Yin smiled bitterly and followed the crowd to stand up. He didn't know what kind of bad luck he had gone through and inexplicably fell into this dangerous situation. Until now, he didn't know where he was or who the soldiers around him were. He was pondering when he suddenly heard a whistling sound in the direction of the valley mouth, from far to near, from high to low. Tang Yin instinctively looked up and his eyes widened. He saw countless black carved feather arrows flying in the sky, covering the sky like a huge black cloth. Even the sun was almost blocked, and these arrows, densely packed like raindrops, were flying rapidly in his direction. Ah! Tang Yin had never seen such a scene in his life before, and couldn't help but exclaim in surprise, while also crouching in response. Pop, pop, pop. Ah! Ah! The valley is open, with no place to hide or escape, and the rain of arrows is pouring down almost unstoppably. For a moment, the sound of iron colliding at the bottom of the valley, the muffled sound of human piercing, and the heart-wrenching screams merged into a dense, massive, and ferocious array of arrows, like the palm of death's open hand, mercilessly ravaging all life it could reach. The soldiers who were the first to suffer were those who threw away their shields while fleeing. They had no armor to block the roaring arrows, and their bodies were almost instantly nailed to hedgehogs, falling into a pool of blood like porcupines. And the soldiers holding shields did not hold on for too long. Although the shields successfully protected their upper bodies, they could not protect their legs and feet. From time to time, soldiers were shot through by carved feathers and screamed and fell to the ground, but before they could get up, they were shot to the ground by the rain of arrows that followed. This is not a war, but a unilateral massacre. P.S. Yesterday just now, today I saw many familiar faces in the book review section. Lu Dao really thanks everyone for their continuous support. Lu Dao will also write Tang Yin with great care, but his work has just been released and his collection is not yet ideal. Lu Dao sincerely hopes that everyone can share their message and support him. Give me a ticket, please bookmark it. Tang Yin cannot achieve success without your support. Thank you. Chapter 6. Seeking Collection. You are listening at novelfull.audio. More than 3,000 soldiers, under the sharp arrow array, have already lost most of their lives in an instant. Reading novels to the climax, Tang Yin's skills are good, but even in such a dense array of arrows, even his best skills have become insignificant. He squatted on the ground, shrinking his body to the point where he held onto a half-spear with one hand and knocked down the eagle feathers that occasionally flew. In just a moment, he was already sweating profusely from exhaustion. This is not a solution. Tang Yin took some time to wipe off a cold sweat on his forehead, turned his head, and saw that there were fewer arrows and rain attacking the root of the valley cliff. He made a quick decision and pulled the clothes of the middle-aged man beside him, saying urgently, "Let's go there to hide." In a hurry, he didn't care about pretending to be mute anymore, and didn't care if the other party could understand him. He just grabbed the middle-aged man's clothes and ran towards the root of the cliff. But after pulling a few times, the middle-aged man's body remained motionless, as if there was no intention of following him. Tang Yin was very anxious and turned around to shout, "Why don't you leave? Stay and wait for death." Halfway through the conversation, he swallowed the rest back. The middle-aged man didn't want to go with him, but he couldn't go anymore. A black arrow feather hit his helmet at some point, and its powerful force directly pierced through the iron sheet and pierced his head. The arrow tip poked out from the back of his head, and crimson blood trickled out. A deadly arrow. When the middle-aged man died, he didn't even have time to shout. The big living person who was still bouncing around just now, and the uncle, who saved his life not long ago, died in just the blink of an eye. Tang Yin couldn't react for a moment and looked at the body, staring wide-eyed and stunned. But just as he was in a daze, a sharp arrow hung with a hissing sound of the wind, fiercely nailed to his shoulder. With a muffled thud, his clothes and flesh were immediately pierced through, and the iron arrow of the arrow penetrated deep into his flesh and blood. Oh! Tang Yin, who was so strong, also let out a muffled groan in pain, and his half-squatted body sat on the ground under the impact. There was no time to take a breath, and then several sharp arrows flew in. Tang Yin didn't even think about it. He grabbed the arrow body that was exposed on his shoulder and pulled it outwards with a sudden jerk. The sharp arrow was forcefully pulled out by him, accompanied by a blood arrow that shot out. The excruciating pain in his bone marrow didn't make him frown, but instead raised the corner of his mouth high. He was like a cunning rabbit, fiercely flying towards the cliff roots. Swish, swish, swish. 3 sharp arrows almost whizzed past his body. Tang Yin's movements were fast, and his forward thrust was also extremely strong. He jumped out of the air 3 meters away, and after landing, his body did not stop and continued to roll forward. At a short distance of 20 meters, he blocked 5 sharp arrows and dodged no less than 20. When he successfully hid under the cliff, he finally exhaled his turbid breath. As he had just judged, there were not many arrows shooting at the bottom of the cliff. Many carved feathers were still flying in mid-air when they were blocked by the protruding stones on the cliff. Occasional sharp arrows flying over no longer posed a great threat to Tang Yin. It was not until then that he took the opportunity to carefully observe the situation in the valley. The opponent's arrow formation had already been shot several rounds, and the entire valley was covered by dense arrow branches. Countless arrow feathers penetrated the ground in all directions, covering the corpses of the soldiers in darkness. However, it could not cover the crimson blood, which flowed through the crevices of the stone heads, merging into rivers and piercing the eyes. Strangely enough, blood was flowing continuously towards him, and Tang Yin didn't pay much attention, only thinking it was due to his lower terrain. The soldiers who narrowly escaped the arrow formation were still wailing in pain, crying and wailing, with a mournful voice as if from hell, or rather, the valley had already turned into hell. As if a century had passed, the arrow formation finally came to a stop. There was no wind in the valley, but Tang Yin felt a chill in his body. He reached out to touch his clothes, which were already soaked in sweat, as if he had just been drenched in rain. Tang Yin's physical strength was suddenly drained, and he felt dizzy and unable to stand. He slowly sat down against the cliff. He wanted to take a break, but the other party didn't give him this opportunity. Bang, bang, bang. A neat and rhythmic loud sound came from the direction of the valley mouth, accompanied by the entire ground shaking and trembling. A hint of surprise flashed on Tang Yin's face. He turned his head to look at the valley mouth, but it was better if he didn't look. At this glance, Tang Yin's heart cooled halfway. At the entrance of the valley, a large number of soldiers wearing silver armor formed a neat formation, marching with unified steps and pressing forward step by step. The densely arranged in silver armor, under the shadow of the sun, looked like a huge mirror, so bright that it didn't feel like it was being looked at directly. At the same time, an invisible yet real pressure rushed towards us, causing people to feel anxious and unable to catch their breath. Tang Yin has never felt such pressure before. You don't have to run up close to count, just watch from a distance, listen to the soul-shaking footsteps, and it's not difficult to guess the number of people on the other side. This formation has over 10,000 members in a few, so many people don't need to use weapons. If one person punches or kicks themselves, they will also have to turn into meat sauce. He is a person who has experienced great storms and waves. He used to be able to remain calm and composed in the face of such a dangerous situation, but now he is panicked, and the panic is very thorough because he knows very well that in the current situation, he has no chance of survival no matter what. Tang Yin's dry and cracked lips, big beads of sweat dripping down his temples, and out of reaction, he sat on the ground and vigorously rubbed back. Unfortunately, behind him was a hard and cold cliff, with no way out. Who? Tang Yin sighed and shook his head with a bitter smile. It was unexpected that he could survive the gunfire and bullets in the underworld, but now he had to die on this damn cold weapon battlefield. What's even more ironic is that he didn't even know how he got caught up in it, and his death was inexplicable. Is this the punishment from heaven for killing him too severely? He thought to himself with self-deprecation, and just then, he suddenly realized that his hand felt a bit soft when pressed down on the ground. The valley is filled with stones everywhere, and the grass has not yet grown. There is no soil, how could there be a feeling of looseness? He quickly lowered his head to check, and there were many cracks on the cliff behind him, and all the blood flowing through the cracks flowed in. It was obvious that there was nothing inside. Upon discovering this, Tang Yin felt as if he had discovered a new continent, with a surprised expression on his face. He grabbed half of his spear and thrust it hard into the crack, only to hear a pounce. The entire tip of the spear sank into it. If it were really a stone, with his current strength, it would be impossible to pierce the spear so deep. Sure enough, it's empty. There's actually a cave here. His heartbeat quickened, he gritted his teeth and propped up his tired body, using both hands and feet, desperately digging through the rubble at the foot of the wall. Wow, wow. Quickly, he dug up the gravel from the activity, and a dog hole-like hole appeared at the foot of the wall. Inside, it was pitch black, and nothing could be seen clearly. Due to the small size of the cave opening, he wanted to dig bigger, but the cliffs around the hole were too sturdy. Even if he broke the tip of his spear, he didn't dig a single inch. Tang Yin, who only saw a 1-foot-long hole, turned around and looked at the approaching opponent's formation. There was no time to hesitate. He bent down and forcefully drilled into the hole. Although his figure was thin, the hole was still too narrow for him. As he burrowed in, the sharp edges of the stones around him were like knives, cutting through his clothes and cutting deep into his flesh. It was very painful. He was sweating profusely and tears flowed down his face, but he dared not shout or even speak. The enemy's soldiers are already very close. Due to the dim valley bottom and being at the foot of the cliff, the enemy may not have seen him yet, but when he shouts, it will definitely attract the enemy's attention. He dared not take risks and gritted his teeth. When he finally passed through the hole and entered it, he felt like he had collapsed, sweat flowing through the just scratched blood hole, and a burning pain. Tang Yin sat weakly on the ground, panting heavily while surveying the cave. Taking advantage of the faint light coming from the cave entrance, he found that the cave was quite spacious, although this spaciousness was only relative to the narrow entrance. The cave was a round passage, and he couldn't see exactly how deep it was inside. Instead, blood flowing from the entrance of the cave kept flowing towards it. He sat on the ground resting for a short time when suddenly he heard screams outside. He was startled and quickly lay on the ground, peering through the hole to peek outside. Those soldiers wearing silver armor have already entered the bottom of the valley, and a team of tens of thousands of people, like a steel giant, mercilessly trample on the ground corpses. Once it is found that there are still surviving soldiers, regardless of whether they are injured or not, their spears are all down, piercing them into a hornet's nest. Tang Yin felt that even though he was a person with cruel wrists, these soldiers outside were even colder and more ruthless than him. They were simply emotionless killing machines. The cold light in the eyes of the soldiers made Tang Yin, who was bloodthirsty, feel uncomfortable. 3,000 people, all lying dead in the valley in the blink of an eye, this is the cruelty of war. The cave entrance where Tang Yin was hiding was narrow and located at the corner of the cliff, making it extremely difficult to detect. He thought he could escape this disaster this time, but soon realized that he was wrong. After the other party swept through, they did not stop and sprinkled oil on the valley. Before leaving, they lit the oil and in an instant, the valley turned into a sea of fire. Thick black smoke poured in from outside the cave entrance, and a golden star appeared in front of Tang Yin's eyes. He wanted to block the entrance, but there was no soil or even stones inside. Helpless, he bravely walked towards the cave, but it was not as deep as he had imagined. He walked out less than 20 meters and the cave was at its end. Cough cough. He coughed violently while quickly touching the cave wall, hoping to find a way out. After a while, he was desperate. The cave was dead and there was no other way out. In the end, Tang Yin sat slowly on the ground, helpless and exhausted. The arrow wound on his shoulder was still bleeding, slowly pulling his strength away from his body. Did you die here? Died inexplicably in an inexplicable place. Tang Yin lifted his clothes, covered his mouth and nose, and lowered his head with a bitter smile. P.S. I hope everyone can save it. There aren't many XDJM that we know so far from yesterday. Could you please share this with each other? Thank you. Chapter 7. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The oxygen in the cave is getting thinner and thinner, and his consciousness is gradually peeling off his body. His eyelids are becoming heavier and heavier. He knows very well that once he closes his eyes, he can no longer open them. If he wants to live, he must stay awake. The thick smoke had already filled the cave, and if it were an ordinary person, they would have fainted long ago. Tang Yin's persistence was entirely due to his strong willpower and survival support. He did not notice that the blood flowing from his shoulder wound did not disappear upon landing, but rather flowed towards the nearby ground and disappeared as if under some kind of suction. The blood that had flowed from the opening also flowed there and disappeared without a trace. Just as Tang Yin couldn't even maintain his sitting posture and his body was on the verge of collapse, he suddenly felt a vibration on the ground beneath him. He is not very certain because his consciousness is becoming increasingly blurred, and it may also be his hallucination. Bang! Suddenly, a muffled sound came from the silent cave, and Tang Yin was startled. He struggled to raise his eyes and looked for the sound. After glancing twice, he suspected that his eyes had been blurred by the thick smoke. He couldn't help but lift his hand and rub his eyes vigorously. Looking again, his eyes gradually widened and his mouth unconsciously slowly opened. Not far from him, an arm stretched out from the ground, more like a hand bone than an arm. Perhaps it was too old, and the hand bone had turned black-brown, with dark, dry flesh connecting between the bones. In a black hole that was originally impossible for anyone to discover, an arm suddenly extended from the ground, which was extremely eerie. Tang Yin's scalp was tingling, and his hair was almost standing on end. If it weren't for blocking his mouth and nose with clothes, he would have screamed in surprise. Click, click. With the sound of the stone breaking, cracks began to appear on the ground around the arm. Then, the cracks grew larger and more, and the ground seemed to be breathing, fluctuating. Tang Yin, who was close at hand, stared in amazement. He had an impulse to immediately escape from this place, but suddenly his body seemed to no longer belong to him and he couldn't move. He sat there dumbfounded. Who? Suddenly, the gravel on the ground bounced open, and a skeleton with no skin but dry meat sat up from the ground. Although the cave was filled with thick smoke, Tang Yin seemed to still smell a smell of decay. Ghost. Yes, is it a ghost? Tang Yin never believed in ghosts in the world. He had killed so many people, and there were countless souls under his sword. However, no ghost had ever approached him. Now, he couldn't explain what was going on. In short, his world had completely changed on this day. Wow. The withered skeleton slowly stood up from the ground, and Tang Yin's heart was beating faster and faster. He heard the sound of the skeleton's movement and the creaking sound of its bones, and saw its head gradually turning towards him. He couldn't see the eyes of the skeleton, but into two black holes, a ghostly red light flickered inside. When those two red lights landed on Tang Yin's face, he seemed to have forgotten to breathe. An invisible pressure suddenly struck, as if it was about to crush his body. The originally lifeless skeleton now has life and walks step by step towards Tang Yin. Tang Yin couldn't move his body and watched helplessly as the skeleton approached him. He bent down and leaned his head close to him. His face, devoid of flesh and blood, was almost as fierce and terrifying as his own. Without warning, the skull's eyebrows suddenly emitted a dazzling light, shining directly on the center of Tang Yin's forehead. The latter only felt his head buzzing, and then his eyes turned black, knowing nothing. Tang Yin felt like he had a long dream, in which he became a dark spirit cultivator named Yen Lai. He deeply loves that woman, the one named Crystal. He can do everything for her, dedicate everything, even his own life. For her, he engaged in a duel with 5 top-notch light cultivators in the Xianin Valley. That battle can be considered a pinnacle showdown between light and dark spiritual weapons. As a result, neither side achieved victory and ended up losing both sides. He didn't ask for her gratitude, nor did he ask for her return, but ironically, Crystal betrayed him. They betrayed the oath they had made before, and after he had done everything for her, she actually brought Zuanzenzi to cruelly kill him, who was seriously injured. He will never forget Zuanzenzi's wild laughter in front of him, as well as his intimate posture with Crystal. In his dream, Tang Yin could clearly feel the excruciating pain before his death. It was not physical pain, but pain from within and imprinted in his soul. The betrayal of his body was like sulfuric acid, burning and corroding his body layer by layer. Crystal. Tang Yin suddenly opened his eyes and murmured the name that was both familiar and unfamiliar to him. Yen Lai was dead, but before he died, he used the dark spiritual martial arts of death sacrifice. Death sacrifice can be considered as the only sacrificial skill in dark spiritual martial arts. It is reborn upon encountering blood and combined with the closest life, allowing the opponent to inherit his memory and power. 500 years later, the brutal battle that occurred in the valley of Xianin Mountain resulted in the tragic death of more than 3,000 soldiers in Fenghua. The blood of the soldiers awakened the severity, and Tang Yin, the only person who survived and was close to him, naturally became his successor. Unfortunately, his spiritual energy had been exhausted, and Tang Yin did not inherit much spiritual energy. When Tang Yin regained consciousness, the severe skeleton had already disappeared, and it had transformed into spiritual energy, which was absorbed by him when he fell unconscious. Although Tang Yin did not receive much spiritual energy, the intense memory had benefited him greatly. At least he had already understood the world he was in. The name of the country he was in was Haotian, founded by Yin Zhuan and with its capital in Shangjing. Haotian Emperor had 9 major vassal states in his country, namely Zhen, Yu, Mo, Feng, Ning, and Chuan, Huan, and Shinqi. 200 years after the founding of Yin Zhuan, the central imperial power gradually weakened, while the power of local vassals increased significantly. Gradually, local power had reached the point of competing with the central royal family. However, during the harsh times, although there were often conflicts and frictions between the vassal states, considering the power of the Shangjing royal family, they dared not easily conflict. However, the war that Tang Yin had just experienced, with the harsh memory, I can't explain it clearly, but I only know that the soldiers wearing black armor are from Fenghua, which is also the hometown of Yan Lai. But the area around Xianyi Mountain is not the territory of Fenghua. I don't know why the soldiers of Fenghua appeared here. Having a strong memory is equivalent to merging Tang Yin and Yan Lai, 2 unrelated individuals, into one. However, this did not make Tang Yin feel relaxed, but rather made his mood even heavier. Firstly, he understood why he had experienced all these inexplicable things. It was because for some unknown reason, he suddenly came from the world he was into this strange and magical world, and what was fatal was that he couldn't find a way back. Secondly, he inherited the intense grief and determination before his death. He detested the betrayal of Crystal, but at the same time, he couldn't help but deeply love this woman, even though she gave him a shame that he could never wash away. You must find the crystal. Tang Yin sat up abruptly from the ground, with crystal figures in his mind. Thinking about it, he shook his head hard again, trying to shake the figure of the crystal out of his mind. After all, the crystal is a serious problem, not his own Tang Yin's problem. However, no matter how hard he tried, the smile and frown of the crystal always unconsciously appeared in his mind. In the end, he gave up and realized one thing. The stern soul had completely merged with his own soul, and the people and things that the stern cared about had become the people and things he cared about. In other words, he was now both Tang Yin and stern. It seems that we should go find Crystal first and solve this matter. Tang Yin murmured silently in his heart. As for how to solve the problem after finding the crystal, Tang Yin is not sure. At least Yan Lai loves and hates the crystal fiercely, so deeply that he can't bear to hurt a single hair. There is such a strong contrast in the feeling of someone, which Tang Yin has never experienced before, and this feeling also makes him very unfamiliar. With a long sigh, he regained consciousness from his contemplation, and only then did he realize that the fire in the valley had extinguished, and the thick smoke from the cave had long disappeared. He slowly stood up, feeling his body particularly agile. Not only did he not feel injured, but he was also stronger than before. Even the wounds on the body have healed and are as good as ever. This should be the result of absorbing spiritual energy. Tang Yin stood still, held his breath, and quietly felt the spiritual energy flowing inside his body. Although it was not as much as Yan Yan's original spiritual energy, it had at least laid the foundation. It should be noted that the most difficult part of dark spiritual martial arts is to enter the beginner level, which is also the reason why there are far fewer people practicing dark spiritual martial arts than those practicing light spiritual martial arts. Tang Yin has limited spiritual energy and cannot move the giant stone at the entrance of the cave, but it is still possible to enlarge the large mouth of the dog hole. He climbed out of the cave, looked around the vast valley, and wherever he could see, there were charred and twisted corpses everywhere. The air was filled with a strong smell of burning, which was nauseating. These corpses are all Wind Country warriors who died as guests in a foreign land. He slowly clenched his fist and gritted his lips tightly with his teeth. His grief and anger did not come from Tang Yin, but from harshness. The fallen leaves need to take root, but unfortunately he doesn't have the ability to transport so many corpses back to Fenghua, nor does he have the ability to bury them on the spot, watching them die in the wilderness. Sigh. He let out a long sigh, his heart turned sideways, and he strode towards the valley. He felt like he had gone crazy staying here for another second. P.S. I hope everyone can save it. There aren't many XDJM that we know so far from yesterday. Could you please share this with each other? Thank you. Chapter 8. Seeking Collection. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After leaving the Xianin Valley, he hurried north, which was the territory of Fenghua and also the location of the crystal. Reading novels to the climax, Xianin Mountain is not far from Fengdi, but it is also not close. If you walk, it will take at least 3 to 5 days to reach. Along the way, there were traces of war everywhere we passed, with remnants and broken armor visible everywhere, and even tattered military flags could be found. Most of these belonged to the Wind Kingdom, indicating that in this struggle, the Wind Kingdom was defeated, and the defeat was extremely tragic. The soldiers who died in battle were not only the 3,000 people buried in the Xianin Mountain Valley. As the sky gradually darkened, Tang Yin also hurried for a long distance and was about to find a place to rest when he heard faint cries of killing ahead. There's a battle. Tang Yin's spirit was one of the shocks, accelerating his pace. Not long after, he noticed the figure swaying ahead. To be careful, he didn't rush directly, but hid in the grass on the roadside, approaching and checking the situation of the battle. On the battlefield, there was a large group of soldiers wearing silver armor, at least hundreds of people, and it was unclear what was happening in the center of the crowd, with cries of slaughter and screams heard. Tang Yin surveyed the battle situation and quickly estimated in his heart. After a moment of silence, he stood up abruptly, intending to rush out. But at this moment, a deep voice suddenly sounded from behind him, "You're just one person. How could you outdo them by hundreds? If you go out now, it's like dying." Upon hearing this, Tang Yin was startled and quickly turned back, showing an attacking posture. Due to his practice of martial arts since childhood, his 6 consciousnesses have always exceeded that of ordinary people. However, in Tang Yin's eyes, it is unbelievable that the other party approaches him without noticing behind his back. There was a person crouching in the grass 5 meters behind him, dressed in the black armor of Fenghua, facing his face. He should not be young, only in his early 20s, and holding a spear in his hand. "Are you from Fenghua?" Tang Yin stared coldly at the young man. If it weren't for the combination with Yen Lai, Tang Yin wouldn't have understood what the other person was saying, let alone spoken their language. "Ha!" The young man chuckled lightly and said, "If I hadn't been a wind person, you would have died long ago." Although the other party's words were arrogant, Tang Yin had to admit it was a fact. Since he could approach his back silently, it would be easy to kill him. He furrowed his brow and said coldly, "Your skills are not bad. Why don't you go out and kill the enemy, and hide here?" The young man grinned and shook his head, saying, "Go out and kill the enemy. I have never practiced spiritual martial arts, and going out will only lead to death very quickly." Tang Yin's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise, and he asked suspiciously, "So how did you run behind me? I've been here all along and haven't moved." Tang Yin was speechless, thinking that the young man was a master, but he had overestimated him. He no longer entangled himself with the youth, turned to the battlefield and asked, "What's going on there?" The young man shrugged helplessly and said, "There are more than 20 brothers trapped by a group of soldiers from the enemy country. When they have already fired half a pillar of incense, it is estimated that there are not many surviving brothers left inside." Tang Yin was both angry and amused by the indifference of young people who spoke without considering current affairs. He raised his eyebrows and sneered, "Your companions are fighting hard on the battlefield, but you are hiding here to watch the excitement. The young man shrugged helplessly and said, "Even if I go out, it won't help." Tang Yin, with a gloomy face and a fierce lunge, rushed directly to the young man. Before the latter could react, he grabbed the young man's spear, then turned around and rushed silently to the battlefield. Hey! Tang Yin's speed was too fast, and it was already too late for the young man to stop him. Tang Yin's body was like a black panther, and he leaped out of the grass with 2 leaps. He arrived at the battlefield, piercing forward with his spear. Puzzle. The silver-armored soldiers focused their attention on the enemy in the center of the crowd, but unexpectedly, they suddenly killed the enemy from behind. With a scream, a soldier's heart was pierced by a spear, and the bloody tip of the spear protruded from his chest. Ah! The silver-armored soldiers around instinctively screamed at the sight, but before they could turn around and attack Tang Yin, he forcefully thrust his arms and with a whoosh, the corpse hanging on his spear was thrown out and collided with a group of soldiers. There are enemies here. The silver-armored soldiers finally reacted and rushed towards Tang Yin with more than 10 people in an instant. When observing the battle just now, Tang Yin had already confirmed that although there were many opponents, there were no spiritual cultivators. They were all ordinary soldiers. Don't bring more than 10 of them, even if 100 or so people came to attack him, he wouldn't take them seriously. Humph. Tang Yin raised the corner of his mouth and sneered, wielding a spear with all his might. Shwa. The nearly 3-meter-long spear was used by him as a knife, and the sharp tip of the spear drew a half-moon-shaped cold light in the air. The silver armor on the chest of several soldiers in front of him broke, and blood spurted from their chest, causing them to fall on their backs. The soldiers behind did not expect Tang Yin to be so powerful. Judging from his clothing, he was just an ordinary soldier in the Wind Country, but his skills were almost as strong as those of the spirit warrior. Just as they were stunned, Tang Yin's spear pierced out like a spirit snake. Pop, pop, pop. The 3 consecutive spears accurately pierced the necks, throats of the 3 soldiers, and they died on the spot without even making a sound. Speaking slowly, in fact it is extremely fast. Tang Yin's body movements are fast, his attacks are faster, and his moves are deadly. He managed to defeat more than 10 soldiers in just an instant. At this moment, the soldiers in silver armor began to panic. They stood in front of each other and were intimidated by Tang Yin. They retreated in fear, while the soldiers behind them didn't know what was happening ahead and continued to charge forward. With each retreat, they collided with each other, causing their formation to become chaotic. Tang Yin took the opportunity to carve out a bloody path and rushed into the center of the battlefield. The soldiers of Fengguo were indeed trapped inside the field, with more than 20 corpses lying on the ground, including enemies and Fengren. There were less than 10 surviving Fengguo soldiers below. Tang Yin glanced up without any delay, waved his spear, and shouted loudly, "Follow me." After speaking, he turned back to kill. Several soldiers from Fengguo were trapped in the enemy's encirclement, thinking they were dead and engaged in a trapped animal battle. However, they never expected that at the critical moment, their own reinforcements would arrive. Although they were only one person wearing soldier's armor, their skills were exceptionally impressive. They felt like they had entered an uninhabited territory in the enemy's formation, and the enemy soldiers had not yet taken 3 steps before they were swept to the ground. Kill. Several soldiers from Fengguo increased their fighting spirit and, relying on their survival spirit, followed Tang Yin to break out of the encirclement. Tang Yin deliberately slowed down to the end, then pointed to the grass where he had just hidden and shouted loudly, "You guys run over there, I'll cut off the rear." After leaving him alone, the soldiers naturally couldn't rest assured, but they couldn't control so much in an emergency. They all responded and crawled into the bushes by the roadside. The reason why Tang Yin pointed the road that way was because he had just come out of there and knew that there were no lurking enemies around. Moreover, the young man was also in the grass, and if the soldiers ran towards that direction, he would definitely follow. At this time, Tang Yin did not want anyone to stay. The enemy that had been annihilated by the eyes was about to slip under their own eyelids. The silver-armored soldiers could not be content and chased after them together. Tang Yin stood still, holding a spear with one hand and turning sideways, looking around at the numerous enemies in front of him. He said coldly, "There's no need to chase anymore, your opponent is here. Kill him first." "Yes. Kill this guy first." The soldiers in silver armor saw that Tang Yin was not simple, but they relied on the large number of people and did not fear him. Dozens of people gathered and approached, trapping Tang Yin in the center. P.S. Today celebrates Daoj's birthday, special chapter 4. Hope everyone blesses Daoj together. Everyone's collection and voting are the greatest blessings to Daoj. You can also reply directly under the blessing post.